Hello and welcome to Scriptorium. My name is Ernesto. I'll be your host today. So today we're going to be talking about about building the perfect protagonist. The word "perfect," of course, is a reference to the particular story and the overall world. In some cases, the world is shared by several protagonists. So let's start with the first setup. That's the first stage, which is the setup. The protagonist needs several things: a decent backdrop to highlight their status, the right initial environment to spark the fire, and a sufficient explanation to make sure that their future debut as a badass is logical. The worst thing you can do is literally bring up something that randomly happens, and all of a sudden now they're like god tier, and they're just beating everybody up. That's literally the dumbest thing you can do. It totally nerfs your character in the psychological sense. It makes them awesome, but then they just become like a backdrop. So the backstory is key in the initial character development. I can't really understate how awesome backstory is when done right. When you do too much backstory, you literally kill your story, and people don't stick around for 3 hours of backstory when it could have been done in 10 minutes. So it needs to be succinct yet effective. For example, let's say a 13-episode anime can literally set up the whole story in half of the first episode, whereas a longer-running series will stretch it out because they're clearly after the financial gains as opposed to the being effective storytellers. So now we want the readers to know exactly where the protagonist started, what they had to go through, and how they became who they are. So it's important to kind of see how the character grows. Now you want to surround your future protagonist, because at this point in time they're not the protagonist yet, with colorful personalities that kind of highlight and bring out their own special traits. Now, when you do this, you don't want these overly convenient situations, but instead a seemingly reasonable chain of events. That way your reader can kind of relate to the character. If it just happens to fit, or it's just way too convenient, they become a Mary Sue or a Gary Sue, and what usually happens with those characters is they become very uninteresting after a short amount of time. That's kind of the Superman problem, kind of already has the abilities, and it's kind of like there's really no story there. There's a psychological story, but there's not really a lot of build up from there, unless you tell a story from his own thoughts. You get where I'm going with this. Superman's he's a bad character from the development standpoint. So the protagonist is molded and developed over time. They need to be. If they just kind of all of a sudden grow up and they're awesome, like I said, it kind of doesn't have the same effect as seeing them grow, kind of almost being part of their journey. Now, like most people in real life, we hold on to important moments in our developmental years like they're gold, because we literally can't get them back, for better or worse. Now, your protagonist kind of should have that same vibe going on, and it kind of reminds them of who they are. It kind of gives them it's a constant reminder, literally, of who they are. Now the last part. So now you set up the stage, you set up the environment, and you kind of put the building blocks. Now it's time to ignite the fire. So, yeah. Now here's the important thing, though. It can't just be anything. It has to be something that really means a lot to the protagonist, and actually to the story as a whole, because the protagonists should really be tied to the story inextricably. Because if they're not, then they're basically tertiary character, or most secondary or tertiary, and they're not as important. So your story should be able to exist with your story shouldn't die when the protagonist dies, but it should also need the protagonist. The protagonist is important as a catalyst and as an integral part of the story, but the story itself should still kind of be strong on its own. And it's a neat little interplay that good stories tend to have with their protagonist. And sometimes they can swap out protagonist if the story's strong enough. A story that's too protagonist centric has the habit, or frequently, kind of just ends when the protagonist dies. So you kind of don't have, unless you have a generational story, it shortens the lifespan of your story and the potential. Okay, so next step is the call to action. So this is where now we have the why part of the story. So it's here that you can determine the scope and the length of the protagonist's mission. Speaking of the protagonist being tied into the story. If it's built in from the beginning that the protagonist has an interest that goes beyond the initial conflict, a sequel or subsequent stories won't feel forced. The easiest way to ensure a smooth transition from one arc to the next is to have layered conflict. Using an ultimate villain is really only good for like a one shot, and nothing wrong with that. They're fun, they're interesting, but if you don't provide any tie-ins or some reason for people to continue reading, they're just going to feel like it's another side story. Now, if you bring back the same villains all the time, it's kind of like getting a bad cup of coffee. Just okay, yeah, I've seen it. Okay, this is gross. I don't want it. Unfortunately, this is common with stories. It's not necessarily a deal killer. For example, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is actually really good at this. They have a cool way of bringing back similar concepts. Dio, for example, pops in several times. But every time he's just such an awesome character. People don't mind. They kind of want to see him go and, show everybody that they're not as awesome as they thought they were. But they do it in such a way that it works. But that's actually a fairly hard thing to do. For example, where that fails is in Dragon Ball Super, where they bring back Frieza, which, as we've seen more villains after Frieza that were more interesting, Frieza seems like a really bad choice in that regard. Cell or Majin, Cell or maybe even Evil Boo somehow would have been a better choice, because they seem to have, maybe not Boo, but Cell would have been a more interesting choice. I think it would have made the story much more interesting. But they made their Super as a whole mess. Dragon Ball Super was just a massive mess. Okay, so going back to the topic, Frank Herbert, for example, was very good at creating a world that is layered, complex, interesting. So even those stories mostly about Paul Muad'Dib, you still had all sorts of other really interesting characters and subplots and everything. Like there were plans within plans, as I say in the movie. And they even reference Ix, and Ix actually has a really nice history. Leto has some really cool. If you read the prequels, Frank Herbert was a genius. I think Dune really totally outdid Star Wars and Star Trek, but I don't think I'll ever get the credit it deserves. Now, the point is, it needs to be layered, interesting, but still have a connection to the original main story. So there's, again, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure does a great job of this. It's bizarre, but they still leave enough tie-ins and Easter eggs that it works. I mean, they even ignore the plot holes because it works so well. So it's kind of a good example. And it's a short series. And the stories are told effectively enough that you don't lose interest. You jump right back into the next story and it's like, wow, this is awesome. I want to see what else is going to happen. And that's the exact response you want to have from your reader. Now, the protagonist should... Yeah, so the protagonist never disappointed the viewer or the reader in these kind of stories, because there's a lot of contrast between the protagonist and society, the protagonist and the antagonist, and sometimes even between the protagonist and their allies. Again, Dune does a really good job with this. There's a lot of different layers. There's a lot of warring factions. There's a lot of sub-stories. There's a lot of main stories you can get interested in. and they do it in such a way that it just works. I mean, for example, have you seen the Stephen King little thing where it connects all the stories? It's great. Of course, it all had to do with psychic kids and the Dark Tower. Is really fascinating. Anime does a similar thing. Clamp has a um, nice little thing going on where there's time travel involved and reincarnation, and yeah, it's looking at Clamp. It's really fun stuff. Um, Other than the art style, they actually do some really neat stuff. Okay, so that's the call to action. So the why. The why is very important. The why sets up whether you're going to have a short story or a short arc that kind of ends and it's supposed to end shortly, or something that feels like it naturally could extend. Okay, so let's move into the approach. So, right. Now, the protagonist truly shines when they are resolving the conflict. The veteran or steel protagonist will be able to disregard sentiment and literally just go in and take action. Now, a softer protagonist will constantly hesitate, even though the best outcome is really the quick kill. We know that if they just killed the villain, it would all be over. But at the same time, because of moral codes and the fact that you're trying to get a wholesome image out, you're probably not just going to go for the quick kill. I mean, that would, well, you're looking at swords like Punisher at that point in time, and those are seen as more like gory kind of things. But something always pops up and a new villain shows up. So you don't really run out of stories, but it just makes it a bit more, it's a richer tapestry when you look into the morality of it instead of the pragmatism of it. Now, these characters ironically end up costing more lives to be more blood to be spilt, and in the name of virtue. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it's just kind of, if you take a different road, you get different results. Now, if you go straight up and take down the villain, sure, someone else will take his place, but at least you don't inadvertently cause a lot of, well, more death. Now, the crux point is how does your protagonist want to be seen? Now, do they want to be an efficient hero, kind of like a mercenary, or do they want to be the likable champion of the people? Your superheroes tend to want to be the champions of the people. They want to be adored. Your mercenary types, your cop types, they really just want to do the job. They want to be the vigilantes. Just want to get the job done. Neutralize the enemy, destroy the enemy. Very basic thought processes. Champions of the people have to deal with social implications. That, of course, makes for a different type of story, and it drastically changes the approach of the story. So it could actually just be about how the hero or the protagonist relates to the people as opposed to the situation itself. Now, the third option that a protagonist could choose is to just walk away and pretend like it doesn't exist. Now, that would make him more of an anti-hero at that point in time. So maybe they could neutralize the situation, walk away, and not make a big deal out of it. There wouldn't make him a great protagonist, but at the same time, it kind of works, and it's kind of a unique option. There's a Netflix series called Ajin, and the main character is kind of like that. He just wants to do his own thing. He really doesn't care. He has power to do something about what's going on, but he kind of just wants to do his own thing. And honestly, there's kind of nothing wrong with that, except from we expect them to jump into battle, and it's kind of where the story ends up going anyway. But it's kind of refreshing to see a character just be able to walk away from a bad situation. It shows self-preservation, and that's part of being human too. Actually, Ajin, yeah, I definitely recommend it. It's a great series. So moving on to the next part. So the follow-through. So you have now this is a part where things kind of cement a little bit. Now this part is just as important as the approach. So it basically cements their legacy. Now the protagonist that walks away after the big fight, looking all mysterious, they're really just jerks, because they don't go back. They don't actually they don't talk to people. They don't talk to the people buried under the rubble. They don't actually try to help the people after they defeat the big villain. So it might look all awesome, big flying capes and fireballs and everything, but it's not the same as if the hero actually goes back into the flames or goes to help people and, maybe works for the city to rebuild. You don't actually, that's not terribly common. I mean, we just assume it gets fixed. So it's kind of lazy at that point in time. Now, a compassionate protagonist, on the other hand, will face the wrath of the consequences, and they're often not very pretty. So um, sometimes going back and helping people out kind of mitigates the backlash of destroying half the city. And a lot of times they really don't get any. Well, actually, that's why The Incredibles, for example, was not really groundbreaking, but interesting because it looked into what happens afterwards. Most stories don't. I mean, does Superman get sued for destroying buildings or not taking the fights to maybe a rural area where they can't destroy as much? No, he just literally fights in the middle of the city, which is just dumb. Batman kind of does the same thing. So, that's what's cool. That was what was cool about Dragon Ball Z, because a lot of the fights didn't really happen in major areas. Well, some of the fights, for the most part, they didn't try to fight in major metropolitan areas. Usually the villains tried to, but the heroes would try to draw them away from the people and save lives. So, yeah, that follow through is very, very important. um, Now, if they do go the route of actually facing the wrath of their consequences, then you can show a great deal of character development at that point in time. You can show maturity, depth. They can actually become a stronger and more relatable protagonist. They're not just a symbol. They're human. There's a stronger connection that you can feel with that character. Now, there's another route you can go. It's not as fun. Well, actually, it is fun, but it's not as good or morally correct. Um, so if you really want to piss off your readers, you can turn a proud protagonist that was once a beacon of hope or justice or whatever fun word you want to put in there, and literally turn them into a monster, either physically or personality, or after the main conflict is resolved. And that's usually where a lot of the new villains come from. They're former heroes or former protagonists that knew the system, they knew who to go after, and you see it. They kind of do it in DC a little bit. Marvel does it sometimes. There's some characters that kind of play both roles, like they're protagonist and antagonist, like the Centurion. I believe that's his name, the Sentry. Great character because he's he's good and evil at the same time. So he's extremely powerful as a hero, but his villainous side is also equally powerful. So he can undo everything that he did as a hero and just kind of it zeroes out. So this is an interesting step. So you can really pretty much set up the sequel and the follow through, and that kind of determines where that character is going to go. Now, so those are kind of how I see ways that you could build the perfect protagonist. Now, of course, it is relative to the story and the scenarios that are present, because it's a very subjective term, perfect, especially in terms of writing. And the great thing about writing is there is no right and wrong when it comes to nonfiction. So, I mean, there are limits, but there is no right and wrong. Like, characters can be whatever you want them to be. Nonfiction, academia, there are more rules. It's not as fun. It's not as fluid. It's not as there's not as much plasticity. And plasticity is important when it comes to writing, especially creative stuff. There's some plasticity in nonfiction and academic, but not that much. You have your stupid formats you have to follow, and um, yeah, it's just kind of a big headache. Um, and of course, it's really easy. It's really important to remember your protagonist is your lead character. Now, your supporting cast is also important, but your protagonist needs to shine, but they also need to feel somewhat real. And it's really sucks that are some stories, and there's some shows I've seen over the years that the world is fantastic. Everything else is great, but the protagonist is just bleh, or they're dumb, or there's something about the protagonist that doesn't fit the world, and it's not in a it doesn't seem a purposeful way. In a purposeful way, it just seems like the protagonist is pointless. I mean, the world's way more interesting than the protagonist. The protagonist needs to be more interesting and integral to the world. If they're not, then why do it? But also, it's your protagonist, it's your story, and it's literally your world. You can do what the hell you want with it, and as long as you get the intended effect, your writing is successful. That's what I've kind of figured out over time. So that's it for today. Let me know what you think about protagonist and kind of my approach to building protagonists. I do write a lot of characters, and I always look for interesting factors that make them. Well, not all of them are protagonists, of course, but I look for things that make them shine, that will leave them, that allow them to linger in your memory for well after you've read it. Years later, you'll remember that character, because not just because they, took down a meteor, but because of how they behave, because of other elements that kind of built that character. You don't need 100 pages to build a good character. You can literally do it in 5 or 6. In concise is actually a better goal than lengthy and flowery, and like I often kind of mock people who take 10 pages to describe a tree. It's ridiculous. You don't need that much background info. Literally, unless the tree is the main character, it's very possible. It would be a very weird short story, but certain things don't need over descriptions. You literally need one line to describe the physical attributes of a character. The psychological, the emotional attributes are actually much more important. So anyway, that's it for today. That's it for today. So check us out. Instagram, Facebook. Actually, not so much Facebook. So Instagram, Twitter, and of course here on YouTube. Also check out the Toonist on that's TOONIST on Patreon. He's a really good friend of mine. He's actually has a comic strip on one of my websites, Modern Iconoclast, where we look at, and on that website we look at various not necessarily political but societal things. And yeah, it's one of my little passion projects. So like, subscribe if you want to hear more about more stuff, and if you have any topics you want me to kind of look into, or write something on, let me know. And always looking for interesting ideas. I want to see what you guys like, or what you guys. I want to delve as much as I can into the world of writing, and it's really fascinating because it's literally a bottomless pit of awesomeness. And all right, well, have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you guys next